I'm here today in a fortuitous way, so to speak. I'll get to that at the end. And in the interest of time and the fact that a lot of other people are going to speak today, and in the interest of not being redundant with a lot of stuff that's going on, or being said, I should say, I just want to add a couple of observations as to where we're at today. And if you take a step back, and I think we need to do this from time to time, we need to ask ourselves, how did we get here? How did we get here? This thing started over about 18 months ago. Remember what the first thing we were told? We need to flatten the curve. 2 weeks, they told us. Give us 2 weeks to flatten the curve and we can go back to our way of life. And then 2 weeks turned into 30 days, and then 30 days turned into 60, and 60 turned into 6 months, and now here, 18 months later, we're still in that, give us 2 weeks to flatten the curve. And what followed flattening the curve was, well, we need testing. We need mass testing. So being the good people that we are, we kept our businesses closed. We stayed locked in our houses without due process, by the way, house arrest, because we're good people. Right? We were facing a crisis that we hadn't seen in this country. I try to stay away from saying never before, but once in a while that'll slip out. We allowed ourselves to be placed under house arrest. We got testing. We had mass testing. That was followed by, well, we can't go back to our way of life, and we can't give you your freedoms back until we find a vaccine. So being the good people we are, we waited it out. Businesses stayed closed. Our freedoms were continued to be restricted because we're good people. And then we came up with a vaccine. I say we, the medical profession, came up with a vaccine. We thought we were nearing the end, but oh, not so fast. So we went from 2 weeks to flatten the curve to we need everybody tested to we got to wait until there's a vaccine, and now there's a vaccine, and now we're saying you must inject this into your body while this thing is in an experimental phase. I heard one of the authors of the other bill earlier say, you know, if you get the vaccine, well, then you're good. No, you're not. We don't know. There's not enough of a sample size and not enough time has gone by to know what this vaccine might do in the long run. We just don't know. I'm not here to argue that we shouldn't have rushed this vaccine to market. Okay, you know, sometimes in life you got to do some things. You cross your fingers and you say, hey, for the greater good. You say out of an abundance of caution, two phrases I don't like. And then people say it's the right thing to do, and I always say, right for who? And that's a very important question, right for who? So they rushed this thing to market, and I'm not here to argue whether they should have or should not have, but to take an experimental drug that got to bypass the procedures from development to market and then make people take it, I find offensive. And I find it highly intrusive. We're being lied to. We've been lied to from the early days of this pandemic. And now all of these things are being done. The erosion of our rights is really what ticks me off. It's all being done under the guise, well, it's a pandemic. There is no constitutional limit because of a pandemic. It's just not there. In the 1930s, the federal government's public health department, I think that's what it was called at the time, I think that was the forebear to the National Institute of Health, conducted an experiment on poor black men. It's called the Tuskegee experiment, where they injected syphilis into healthy men to study the progress of syphilis. And I'm not here to say that the COVID vaccine is the same as injecting syphilis, but what they did was they used human beings as lab rats. And because we're in this experimental phase today, we are back, and there's a law against this, by the way. As a result of that, we are back to using human beings as lab rats. If you want to volunteer for that, be my guest. But to tell me I have to do it as a condition of employment, or whether or not I can attend a public event, and now you're having some of these private entities, concerts, ball games, whatnot, having separate sections for vaccine versus non-vaccine. That is stigmatizing and it's offensive. Now, that's not your fault. However, there's a role you play in this now. You cannot defer on something this big to the private sector to sort out. You cannot do it. We used to do that in this country until the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which said employers will no longer be able to discriminate on the basis of race, religion, national origin, sexual orientation. We added some things on after that. Well, we need to add this onto the Civil Rights Act. You can't do anything about that, only Congress can. But Congress deferred to the states. Here's what Jen Psaki, the White House press secretary, said last week. White House press secretary Jen Psaki said April 6th that the federal government is not now nor will be supporting a system that requires Americans to carry a credential, and that there will be no federal vaccination databases and no federal mandates requiring everyone to obtain a single vaccination credential, according to the New York Times. They're deferring to the states. They punted. You cannot punt. You cannot defer to the private sector. And I'm a private property guy. However, this is different. That's why we created the 1964 Civil Rights Act. It was different. To make hiring decisions, promotional decisions, whether you're going to let me into a restaurant or other private place open to the public on the basis of having to show proof of something, like I said, it's offensive. I want to try to instill a sense of urgency today about how important this is. This stuff moves too slow. I wish the COVID restrictions moved that slow, but that happened overnight. 23 states now, according to this article, vaccine passports in 23 states, they've passed bans and limitations on vaccine passports. 23 states. Now, many of these were by executive action, which we know we're not going to get out of Governor Evers. However, that shouldn't prevent you, in the best interest, the right thing to do, from passing the legislation to show where you stand in terms of individual freedoms and individual rights. You have an obligation. You have a duty. And this can't take forever. If 23 states have already acted, it is June, and we're just having discussions on it. We cannot be into September, October, November without some sort of legislation reaching the floor of the Assembly or the Senate. And then put people on record. It's okay. That's what our representative democracy is. And then going into next year's election, they can face the voters. Now, I want to close with this. I mentioned about this fortuitous way of me getting here today. I found out about this hearing on Sunday. Somebody called me up and was out of town and said, hey, do you know there's a hearing next week on this potential ban and prohibition on vaccine passports? And of course, I didn't know, which is no big deal. I don't follow this stuff every day. But I know some people that do. So I spent the weekend doing some digging, going through the legislative.gov website. This is a little off discussion, but it's important. Because when I look here today and I see all these good people here, this is a fraction of what would have shown up with better notification, more timely notification. All right, there are about, what, 2.5 million voters in this state? 10% of that would be 250,000. And we got 1% of that here today. The line would be out the Capitol door and some of these other overfill rooms. This is important to people. It really is. They don't know about it. And recently I had a conversation with a former state senator who will go nameless, who said to me, Sheriff, you'd be surprised how many people do not know what's going on in Madison. Well, it's not your fault. Although I think I could lay some of the blame on you. All right, you all have websites. You have access to newspapers, talk radio. I had denounced it on talk radio yesterday. That's not my job. This is an important hearing that I think more people would have had an interest in. And the more I dug into this website, the more confusing this whole process, because I was hearing a lot of that from certain legislators. The process. You have to understand the process. Guess what? The process doesn't work for people. It may work for you, and it may work for special interests, but it doesn't work for people. People can't take off at a moment's notice. Fortunately, I could. I didn't have to take off because I'm retired, at least in my former occupation. But everybody can't do that. Everybody can't drive 200 miles to get here. There's a link in the website, and it says, bringing the people to the process. And I thought, what? How about bringing the process to the people? Which means all of these hearings cannot always just take place in this Capitol building. You have distance, you have time. You heard the last speaker. They got lives, and I hear that a lot from people because I'm trying to organize at the base level right now. And we're busy. I understand. We got jobs. Yeah, I know. Representative government can only prosper with citizen participation. But this website does not encourage citizen participation. Every time you click on a link and you think you've gotten somewhere, it leads you to another link. For this, see that. So every time you think you've gotten through a door, it leads you to another door. And I ended up downloading just some of it. And I said, this is nonsense. It doesn't work. And I just wanted to add that because you'll be taking on some other important issues coming up. Critical race theory, for heaven's sakes. Right? There are a lot of people out there clamoring. Moms, dads, students. They don't want this jammed down their kids' throats. That's not what this hearing is for, but I want to see 10 times as many people, and if you get the notice out in a timely fashion, I'll help get some of them there. I have some platforms and some avenues. So thanks for what you're doing, but please, a sense of urgency. Move this bill along. Thank you.
Any questions? A question that I asked earlier, maybe some perspective. We're talking today about bills under the premise that these are still under experimental use. By midsummer, there may be a federal move to get the FDA to lift the experimental use, which puts a new perspective on the discussion and argument, especially for hospitals' employers that are giving a little leeway to their employees to opt out. But once they lift the experimental, we're guessing that there's going to be more importance to these bills because the opt-out's going to shrink.
Not to mention that the EEOC has granted private businesses the authority to use vaccine passports in hiring decisions. The EEOC, that's 1964 Civil Rights Act. So the government has kind of did a wink and a nod. Well, we're not going to ban it, as Psaki said, but she punted and deferred that authority. But this is in your hands now. This is your baby.
Representative Allen.
Thank you, Sheriff Clarke, for being here. Thank you for driving, and thank you for giving the platform to this and making sure that you spread the news. Appreciate that.
Just pick up the parking citation I might get for the
I have no influence in Madison.
It was worth it to me.
Sheriff Clarke, I'm wondering, these 5 bills, in your opinion, are these Republican bills or Democrat bills? Is this largely a Republican issue or a Democrat issue, or what's your perspective on that?
No, this is a freedom, liberty, choice, and confidentiality issue.